So this is a presentation about Cincinnati's Potter's Field. This is actually the third part of 4 parts, and I have previously referred to that as 3 parts. The history of it is actually 3 parts, and there's a fourth part that gets into the current conditions and the problems and the challenges of maintaining and improving that site. But this is going to be the third piece of the history and really the one piece that's about the history of this site itself. So in the last presentation, I talked about the over the Rhine Pottersfield location, and that was shut down prior to the construction of Washington Park, although Washington Park was across the street. But at that point, they were moving all of the cemeteries out of over the Rhine because it had started to become a very populated area. So the city decided that Pottersfield, its indigent burying ground, needed to be moved to the west side of town because it was farmland and it was very sparsely populated. So in 1852, after a search of where to go, they bought a piece of really hilly, rolling land in what became part of the neighborhood of Price Hill. When they did that, in theory, they moved the roughly 1,800 skeletal remains that had been at the over the Rhine location to this new location in Price Hill. But as I discussed in the last presentation, we don't really know how many of those 1,800 remains were moved. In theory, all of them. In reality, we know as absolute fact that that's not true. But somewhere in excess of 1,000, 1,500 remains were dug up in over the Rhine and moved to the new Pottersfield site in or about 1852. Now, this new site, as I said, is today in Price Hill. At the time, it was pretty much the middle of nowhere. So they purchased this lot of land that was originally 26.38 acres, and it was off of what is now Gurley Road today, which is very near Rapid Run. And so this location, became the new site. And when you walk this site today, you get the sense that it was probably chosen both for its isolation and because I suspect that it was pretty cheap land because it's very hilly. It would be difficult to farm this land, and that's probably part of the motivation of why they bought it. So when you go to Pottersfield today, which I don't necessarily recommend because it's very difficult to walk across it, but if you go there on the corner of it, the south, kind of the south eastern corner of what we call Pottersfield on the western side of Gurley Road, there are 2 markers, and one of them was put up quite a while ago, and the other one is more recent. The thing that these 2 markers have in common is that neither one of them is accurate. They say that the site was opened in 1849, which is not true because the city didn't buy it until 1852. They say that there are between 8,500 to 10,000 people buried there. That is clearly incorrect. The total number is really impossible to know for a variety of reasons, including how many bodies were actually moved from the over the Rhine site. But when you put different records together, it's very clear that the actual number of people interred at Pottersfield is somewhere between 15 and 20,000. And this acreage that the signs claim for where they claim that acreage to be also appears to be completely inaccurate. So in the previous presentation, I discussed the fact that there was an infectious disease hospital near Pottersfield and over the Rhine. And, they had a very symbiotic relationship. A lot of people who went into that hospital died there and then wound up in Pottersfield. So when they shut down the Pottersfield and over the Rhine, they also closed the infectious disease hospital, which had the very unfortunate the very unfortunate common name of the pest house. So they shut down the pest house and they built another one in Clifton Heights, or used another facility in Clifton Heights for a while. But that also was, quickly becoming the center of a highly populated area. And it was not ideal to have an infectious disease hospital surrounded by people who were not inclined to get an infectious disease. So they bought 53 acres, they being the city of Cincinnati, bought 53 acres over in what became Price Hill near Potter's Field to build the new infectious disease hospital. And this was originally called Branch Hospital because it was a branch of the city hospital that was downtown, still near Over the Rhine. So 53 acres gets purchased from what was formerly the Gurley Farm in 1878, and it becomes the new hospital. And the farmhouse that was there was actually one of the original structures that was used as part of the original hospital facility. So when we take a look at a map, this is an 1884 atlas that we're looking at here. We can see Potter's Field down here. This line that runs through it is Gurley Road. And you go up Gurley Road and you turn into what today is Dunham Recreation Area. And originally, this area was where Branch Hospital was. So Branch Hospital opened, the site gets acquired in 1878, it opens in 1879, and it is this branch of the city hospital that deals with infectious disease. By the time we reach 1897, it had transitioned from infectious diseases more generally to really focusing on tuberculosis, which was a major problem and killed a lot of people. And by 1920, it was dealing really exclusively with tuberculosis, and they renamed the facility the Hamilton County Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Now, a lot of people, as a result, who died of tuberculosis wound up in Potter's Field. Just between the years 1936 and 1939, there were 354 people who died of tuberculosis in the hospital. They were all buried in one contiguous unbroken row in Potter's Field. And there's an image here of grave markers. This is not any of those 354 people. None of them received any sort of grave marker at all. So, and this is just a short period of time, but it gives us a sense of how many hundreds of people, how many thousands of people wound up going from the hospital into Potter's Field, into unmarked graves in that period of time that this hospital was in operation. And Dunham Hospital, it's later changed to from the tuberculosis sanatorium to Dunham Hospital, and it remained in operation until 1971. It was a very large hospital. There were huge buildings there that they demolished later in the 1970s. So Potter's Field in Cincinnati, it has people that are there because they're indigent, and it's people who have either just died poor somewhere else in the city, but it's a lot of people who actually died of infectious diseases and were moved from this hospital, and tuberculosis in particular, and the bodies were moved directly from the hospital to Potter's Field. Now, all of this, it's a pretty sad history. And in a former part of this presentation, I talked about the fact that almost every municipality has a Potter's Field, and they're all maintained by somebody. Some of them have fallen into neglect, but Cincinnati really kind of stands out in its neglect of its Potter's Field. But even historically, it stands out for providing no grave markers at all throughout the vast majority of its history. it's really a pretty sad and pretty shameful way that Hamilton County has always decided to treat this site and to treat its indigent dead. Now, there is one exception in this long story of Potter's Field, and that is one single Hamilton County commissioner named Edwin J. Tepe. And Mr. Tepe, unfortunately, only served for one term as county commissioner between 1860 and 1864. But when he did, Mr. Tepe insisted that there be grave markers for the people who were laid to rest at Potter's Field. So there are these metal grave markers that you find on this site. And when you run into those grave markers, and there's a lot of them, but when you run into them, know that they are there only from this period of time between 1960 and 1964. The tens of thousands of people that were buried there outside of this 4-year period of time received either no grave marker at all or grave markers that are more difficult to locate and identify. So all of those grave markers, you can see them at points in very long rows, and they're often covered by underbrush and ground cover, but they all come from that 4-year period of time. And so, this site, it's mismanagement and neglect. It's certainly never been as bad as it is today, but it's never really been maintained well, and the people who have been interred there have really never been treated with any modicum of respect. And so Potter's Field is operated originally by the city of Cincinnati, who owned the site. It was then managed, operated, and controlled by Branch Hospital, later called Dunham Hospital. And then after Dunham closed in 1971, management of the site reverted to Hamilton County. So Hamilton County continued to run this site from 1971 until 1981. And what happened then is in 1980, this woman named Catherine Owens discovered that her father had been mistakenly buried in Potter's Field. And the way that this happened, is a whole series of questionable decisions by Hamilton County. But his identification had disappeared, which, coincidentally just happened to be in his wallet. But the contact information of his kids, disappeared with this wallet. And so they put him in Potter's Field. And, he had family who loved and cared for him, but he lived alone, and he was actually buried in Potter's Field before his family realized that he was dead. So they had the body exhumed to give him a private burial in a family plot. But when they did that, they were horrified to discover the way that bodies were being treated by Hamilton County when they were put into Potter's Field. So, this gentleman, when he was moved and when he was exhumed to be moved, the conditions of the body were pretty deplorable and incredibly disrespectful. So Miss Owens and her family were appalled by this, and they pressured the Hamilton County prosecutor to press criminal charges against the Hamilton County official that was ultimately responsible for managing Potter's Field. And the prosecutor's office did that. So we wind up with, a Hamilton County official being charged with abuse of a corpse. And this is a big public controversy for a little while in 1980, 1981. Eventually, the county promises Mrs. Owens that they're going to clean up the site and they're going to change how people are buried in Potter's Field, and people are henceforth going to be buried with, some basic degree of dignity. So as a result of that, she backs off, and the prosecutor drops the charges, and justice prevails. people are going to be treated with some basic dignity at Potter's Field. But this is Hamilton County, Cincinnati, so that's not where things end. What happens instead, actually, is that once Hamilton County faces the idea that they need to treat the people that are buried in Potter's Field with respect, they decide they just want to give up Potter's Field entirely. So that's what they do. They walk away from it, and they tell the city of Cincinnati, who is actually the owner of the site, that this is now your problem. So the city of Cincinnati has to maintain this site, and as a result, they mow it once, and they never mow it again after that, except for one time under pressure. So they mow it once in 1981. It then becomes really overgrown, and in 1982 they mow it for a second time based on a lot of complaints from the community around it. It was covered in weeds and trash. It was disrespectful to people buried there. It was also just a problem for the neighborhood around it. So the city mowed it again in 1982, and after that, they have not taken care of it ever since. The city of Cincinnati owns the site. They are responsible for maintaining the site, and they have done nothing to maintain it since 1982. Now, their cover for this was somebody from the Parks Department at the time said that they were going to let this site, quote unquote, return to the natural state for the dignity of all who reside there. Now, this was a cop-out at the time. It was recognized as a cop-out at the time, and it is clearly a cop-out in hindsight. Because what has happened there is not respectful to anybody. It is definitely not dignified. I mean, this site, if it was a forested site, that would be fine. That would be dignified. But what it actually became is a place that accumulates junk and garbage, and it is covered in vines and invasive species and invasive ground cover. So the conditions of it are really deplorable, and that's how we got here. It has been an unbroken string of neglect since 1982. The site is currently controlled by the Parks Department. There are people who work for Parks who do care about this site and who are appalled by the conditions of it. But City Council has never allocated any budget for this site to mow it, to maintain it in even the most basic manner. And Parks Department itself has also not allocated any money to respect this site. So it is not respected, and it's overgrown and covered in trash. And the only time that's not covered in trash is when citizens come in and clean it up as volunteers. So we're going to talk about what to do about it and the challenges about correcting this problem in the next segment of this, part 4. This is me, Michael D. Morgan, and this is my email address if you want to know anything further about Potter's Field.